Diablo is ridiculously popular and well, duh. It took the burgeoning genre of fantasy action RPGs, ripped out the slower first-person turn-based combat and gave us real-time hack and slash dungeon crawling with tons of loot to boot. This was like Doom for RPGs. It's hard to understate how much Blizzard's series did for PC gaming, but anyone who played Diablo 2 back in the day already knows. But of course, with any successful video game franchise comes the clones, and oh boy, did Diablo get some.
So yo, it's Austin, and today we're gonna be going back to 1997 in order to dive into the extremely crowded discount bin of forgotten Diablo clones. After all, the dungeon crawling RPG genre is one that pretty much anyone can try to make these days. And speaking of making games, before we get started today, thanks to today's sponsor, Game Maker. Do you, my dear viewer, have an interest in making video games? Well, with Game Maker, you can hop right in there. It's fast, easy to use, and best of all, free. For anyone out there wanting to make themselves an action RPG dungeon crawler, it's more than doable. Games like Hyperlight Drifter, Chicory: A Colorful Tale, and Dronjin: Dungeons of Ink and Paper were all made using this software. Also with hits like Forager and Undertale, you can really see the versatility of this thing. Game Maker is an all-in-one creation tool, which means, well, it has everything you need. There's no need to swap between programs. It's got everything you need to take your game from a concept to a finished product. While a third of the games that come out with Game Maker are by professionals, it's got a lot of ease to use for first-time coders as well. Need to drag and drop? You can do it. You can learn coding with GML Visual in a way that makes sense as well as expresses your artistic ability with the tile set and sprite creators. I never really thought that I myself would be able to get into game development, but Game Maker's made it really simple. There's plenty of tutorials to look at on their website, but there's also a large and active Game Maker Discord and Reddit community, so you can ask questions and get a little feedback. All I'm saying is that in 2022, there's no barrier to entry and it's easier than ever to get into video game development, so you can make whatever your heart desires. I know I'm gonna try one day. With their proven track record of success, games that are really good, now's the time to get started making your dream game. Click the link down in the description to download Game Maker and begin creating a video game today. Thanks to Game Maker for the sponsor, but for now, we gotta head to the deepest pits of, well, not where Diablo lives, because we're talking about clones, and right out of the gate, there were a lot.
The original Diablo has held up extremely well. Yeah, sure, maybe it's a little sluggish, limited in what you can do, and pretty low on scenic variety, but what else could you want out of a game about diving into hell? Around the time this came out, action RPGs were typically a turn-based affair, a lot of them being first person. The older Might and Magic games and other things like that let you take control of a party and explore, but there was really nothing like Diablo in the early 90s. That was one of the first games to take the speed up a lot. Sure, this looks slow in 2022, but back then, the idea of having to fend yourself off from tons of hellish and undead minions was unheard of. On top of that, you had a unique horror that was exceptionally violent for the time. The Butcher in this game and the intro of Blood Omen are two things that horrified me as a child. The quick-paced, loot-centric Diablo would come out to a ridiculous amount of praise. There's a satisfaction I still get to this day watching skeletons explode into a bunch of loot, and considering every one of these does that, I think everyone gets it. On top of that, it had multiplayer. Co-op dungeon crawling is and will always be a 10 out of 10 experience. Why this game was never in the Game of the Year conversations in 96, 97 will always baffle me, but when your competition is stuff like Mario 64 and Final Fantasy VII, I guess I can understand. Plus, this thing came out on January 3rd, which is like a death slot nowadays. So yeah, a Diablo clone. Isometric, tons of loot, dark, moody dungeons to crawl through, real-time hack and slash, no pausing, you get the picture. This is a whole genre these days, but back then, just like a Doom clone, we called them Diablo clones.
I did a little digging, and I could be wrong, but the earliest clone that I found was a little PC game from 1998 called Ancient Evil.
A game that I couldn't get to run well. Whoops. Playing this directly after Diablo really shows you how far ahead of time that game was, and it was over a year prior. Sporting some early 3D, Ancient Evil tries to do a lot of the same stuff mechanically, but feels infinitely slower. The interface has some clunkiness to it that an old PC RPG has, but it doesn't have that same sense of excitement. Combat lacks impact, but hey, they tried. I think the reception on this one was mixed. This is kind of how it would be for a few years going forward. Blizzard had nailed a formula so hard right out of the gate that the isometric dungeon crawling RPG genre wouldn't begin to really take shape for a hot minute, not really until after Diablo 2 in 2000, which it still owns, by the way. However, there's a few games that came out in the late 90s worth mentioning. People might immediately think of, say, Baldur's Gate, but that's not so much Diablo so much as general chaos. Visually, it might be similar, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is much more strategic than, well, a hack and slash. The same goes with Silver, which is like, what if we mashed Baldur's Gate up with Final Fantasy VII models? It's a cool game, though. All right, here's a sentence that's never been said. Two of the best Diablo clones from the early days are Darkstone and Ergite's God Bless the Ring. Yeah, I'm serious. Okay, hold up. Darkstone is a cool little gem that came out on the PC in 1999 and PlayStation 1 in 2001. Not only was this one of the first major Diablo-style games, this one was in full 3D. Unlike Ancient Evil, they actually pulled it off, despite being the same developer as Shaq Fu. You pick up one of 6 characters who are all different gender-locked classes, each of which has a unique look and set of abilities. It's not quite as snappy as Diablo, but the combat works in a similar way where you want to click a dude and watch him blow up. The main shtick here is the fact that you pick 2 characters to play as, so you get yourself a combination of classes, leveling up multiple people and switching between them. In addition to that, Darkstone is a bit more old school and gives us hunger meters, which I'm not really sure Diablo needs. It's more of a nuisance than anything, mostly because your party members are fully voiced.
I am dying of hunger.
I am dying of hunger.
This game does look okay, but because of the shift to 3D, a lot of the detail you'd get out of the 2D sprites is lost, and rather than a detailed gothic horror look, you've got, well, endless corridors with different basic tile sets. Everything looks plain. Similarly to Ancient Evil, it lacks a bit of excitement. However, I think this game's pretty fun to play, and I guarantee you any Diablo fan back in the day was all over it. Or just playing the PS1 version of Deebs. ARPG fans, we're hungry.
I am dying of hunger.
I am dying of hunger.
I am dying of hunger.
Speaking of PS1, it's time for everyone's favorite sound effect.
Dream Factory. It's been a while. So right off the bat, let me just say that for the time, 1998, Ergite's visually looked fantastic, but the whole concept is just bizarre. As many of you know, this is a fighting game, but it had this quest mode that was a dungeon crawler, randomly generated maps, tons of floors, magic spells, and loot for days. But also, Ergite's was a fighting game, so the controls are not great. You assume control of Koji Masuda and Claire Andrews, 2 archaeologists who are looking through ancient ruins that supposedly can grant you immortality. Then they get isekai'd into a totally different world, one that has a similar setup to Tristram. There's a bunch of stuff in town, like shops, and then you can go deeper and deeper into a hole until you eventually uncover the big secret. It's basically Diablo. However, you might fall asleep and miss the story during the opening credit crawl, considering the entire thing is just this. Then when you wake up, both the characters are in this inn, and you can only play as one of them at a time. The weird part is that brand new quest has a recovery mechanic. If you die, that character is then stuck in the ruins, and it's up to the other one to find and rescue them. If you die again, it's game over. Also, the combat doesn't feel great because it's all weapon based, but then the weapons break. The combat's just a little janky. The last thing you want in a game with semi-permanent death is to die because the controls are not good, but here we are. The developer, Dream Factory, did this quest mode in different games over and over until they quietly faded away, but it never really worked. I like how the opening tutorial is a wall of RP dialogue with the inn owner where he's telling you which buttons to press with which finger. Too bad they didn't account for my goblin hands doing the claw. This kind of falls halfway between Diablo and Darkstone in terms of its mechanics, and the more button mashy approach is interesting, but ultimately this wasn't that great. I totally loved it as a kid though, probably because I thought Claire was hot. I blame Tetsuya Nomura.
It is no surprise to me that the early clones of Diablo really failed to hit the mark. I mean, even Blizzard could barely do it themselves with the PlayStation 1 version of the game being as inferior as it was. However, around the time that Diablo 2 launched, we would start to see the good stuff.
It's pretty crazy how the genre dipped into 3D models and then quickly went back to the 2D world. It seemed like people were trying to take the concept and take it to the next level by pushing the third dimension, but that usually came with performance issues. I think after Diablo 2 came out with its extremely beautiful 2D sprite work, people were like, yeah, okay, let's do that. Straight up, there's not enough time to get to everything. We'd all died of old age, and you wouldn't get to play something like Throne of Darkness. Imagine Diablo, except controlling a team of 4 different samurai in feudal Japan as you slice and dice your way through demons and skeletons. This game is solid, just make sure not to skip the opening cutscene. There's also Divine Divinity. I'm sure most, if not all of y'all know Divinity Original Sin. Well, back in 2002, Belgium-based Larian Studios began their now highly regarded franchise with the little Diablo and Baldur's Gate inspired action RPG that may or may not have pioneered moving crates with your bare hands. This thing was solid back then, maybe a bit janky these days, but it's got a lot of charm. Even if the voice acting is interesting.
I'm a bad boy.
One of the absolute strangest games I stumbled onto was a little thing called Shadow Flare. Developed by Japanese group Denusha, Shadow Flare is something that really doesn't have anything on the internet about it. There's an official website, a forum that hasn't had a single post in 8 years, and most of it's just broken links, and well, that's about it. All I can really find is that there's a few developers who went on to work with Game Republic and have credits on Folklore, but yeah, Shadow Flare is an episodic action RPG that wasn't received well with its 40-ish on Metacritic, but it seems to have only gotten digital distribution all the way back in 2002. Its main shtick is that you get to have a companion which will attack and pick up items for you, be it like a dog or a wiener dog, so that's kind of cool. But it kind of sucks when every single time you attack you hear "yeah" over and over. And double that for the dog. I have no idea how I'm supposed to play any of the other episodes or make any progress, but this thing levels you up slower than a Korean MMORPG, which we'll get to later. There's a whole list of Diablo variants over on Moby Games where you can see all sorts of games in this criteria. Eidos' Revenant has you saving the world looking like the guy from the cover of Galleon. A lot of these games all look the same from screenshots, but there's only one of them that lets you play as a guy wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and that's Nox. Developed by Westwood Studios. Yes, Command and Conquer Westwood, Nox is one of the coolest one of these that I've played. Rather than having big budget cutscenes to explain this story, it's mostly done through loading screens and silly, over-the-top Disney Channel tier voice acting.
And the invincible undead will aid my unchallenged rule of all Nox.
Eat your heart out, isekai anime. In Nox, you play as Jack, a guy that lives in a trailer who's yoinked into another dimension, the land of Nox, in order to save the day. Yeah, most of these games are gonna be like that. Though this is the only one that stars like just a normal guy. Nox has a lot of really interesting mechanics that you didn't, and even still to this day, haven't seen too much of. It takes the idea of a 3D action RPG and puts some momentum physics into it. You don't click on doors to open them, you have to push them open by running into them. You can push crates, and different elements work with each other, so you can use water to douse flames. The most unique thing is definitely the field of vision. In Diablo or most other video games, this isn't a thing, but with Nox, you need to directly be in line of sight in order to see. This was called the True Sight Vision System, and it was something that was praised and even advertised back then. There's even small things like a spell that puts a little extra light on your mouse cursor. This does unfortunately make it so the game is surrounded in darkness most of the time, but it was made with that in mind, so it feels right. The finished product is definitely one that was changed a lot. This was originally going to be something to be played with a controller and the use of combos to use spells, like fighting game style. But obviously, that's a ridiculous concept to try and make something normal people have to do. There's remnants of this in the full game though, and they're really similar to like a modern MOBA like Dota though, with certain loadouts being on the bottom of the screen. Each of the 3 classes feel unique and have a lot of cool systems. The Conjurer, which I played as, has the ability to charm animals on the fly. Damage output from everyone is really fast in this game, including towards you, so you'll be using your mana to try and charm dudes over and over just to try and stay alive. Though if you do die, the game just laughs at you.
Well, that was easy.
For how advanced Nox was, coming out a full half year before Diablo 2, there's so much to love. I never got to play it myself at the time, but there was even a moderately popular multiplayer PvP system that got a small but devoted scene. Of all the older games in this video, Nox is probably the best one. It's got the most interesting stuff and the most to talk about. It's genuinely a gem, and you should give this one a shot. Just be prepared for voice acting that sounds like it was recorded by interns in a bathroom, except it's not. Joanna Cassidy's living it up.
Yes! Oh, rise my infernal minions!
Oh, and your main character, Mr. Trailer Trash Jack himself, voiced by Sean William Scott freaking Stifler. Have a nice day.
Wait, please! I need your help!
We left it, but now it's time to go back to the world of 3D. In the early 2000s, the floodgates really opened up, and if you went to like a Circuit City or whatever, you would see the store shelves lined with all these weird action RPGs and 3D Diablo clones you'd never heard of. That's where I remember seeing a copy of Sacred, before quickly passing it up to buy some crappy Dragon Ball Z game. Sorry. Teenagers don't make good decisions.
Though if I had, I'd have been greeted with a pretty cool open world action RPG. Both this and Divinity took the randomized and smaller scale concept of Diablo and turned it into a bigger open world experience, still filled with enemies to kill and loot to find. The big selling point here was definitely the multiple classes all having different narratives and the general exploration. It has a nice weapon switching system built into the hotkeys, and despite the utterly confusing interface, is pretty simple to learn. I never played this as a kid, but I'm weirdly nostalgic for the 3D models on pre-rendered backgrounds. I blame JRPGs. I did, however, play a ton of Sacred 2, although that was on the Xbox 360 at like 2 AM at a LAN center I used to hang out at, so I don't really remember too much of it. It's like a bigger and better version of the original game, still with multiplayer, but now a bit more accessible. You could, and I did, easily sink countless hours into it. From there, the Sacred series went weird as heck. Shortly after Sacred 2, the developer, Acheron Entertainment, disbanded due to insolvent, and the rights to their IPs went to Deep Silver. You'd get an Xbox Live Arcade beat-em-up that I played way too much in 2013 called Sacred Citadel, and the poorly received Sacred 3 a year later, and that's it. Sacred 3 is a little more Gauntlet Legends, and that essentially made Sacred not sacred. 1 and 2 are still neat, highly ambitious, and fun though. As some of y'all know, Deep Silver eventually turned into THQ Nordic, which also is responsible for bringing out one of the best Diablo clones out there, Titan Quest. Originally out in 2006, for a while there, Titan Quest felt like a proper Diablo 3, considering the gap between 2 and 3 was 12 years. Titan Quest is one of the only games to receive proper support throughout the years, getting re-releases on all the newer consoles, and even a new expansion as recently as December 2021. People know this one, so I won't get too much into it, but Titan Quest is a great time. The absence of a proper Diablo 3 was felt hard, and that's definitely because Blizzard really knocked it out of the park with 2. There's a bit of controversy surrounding Diablo 3, as when it came out it felt cartoonish, definitely inspired by the popularity of World of Warcraft. Kinda like the next clone.
There's one more game that was always frequenting store shelves growing up, and I bet you might have seen it yourself, even in a Walmart. In 2005, I couldn't go to a single store without seeing a copy of Fate.
The adventure that's sweeping the nation. Fate, Fate Undiscovered Realms, Fate the Cursed King, Fate the Traitor Soul. This tetralogy of Diablo clones was the little train who refused to quit, and for some reason, just about everyone I know has seen or played them. The concept is simple. Diablo, but for kids. Disgusting children. Rather than acting as expansions, Fate and all of its games were standalone adventures that released every few years between 2005 and 11. These things must have been successful because they kept coming out. The game itself is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. You make a character, pick a pet, then go deep diving into a dungeon. You've got identify scrolls, town scrolls, tons of loot, named enemies, and enough exploding barrels and creepy crawlies to make your XP meters go up. Interestingly though, there's not an actual class system in this game. You get skill points as you level, and you have to dish them out yourself. That's a blessing and a curse. Back in these days, especially if you were a kid and didn't have access to proper internet forums, you might build yourself into a crapshoot and think that dual-wielding strength-based clubs that attack slowly is a good idea. Yep. 32, and I'm still an idiot. The main shtick of this one is actually the name of the game, the Fate system. There's a lot of decisions that you can make that are all based on chance, be it enchanting items, fishing, and it's even there in death. A lot of these Diablo clones can be harsh about this, but Fate is for the kiddos. Anytime you die, you're greeted by the Grim Reaper, who gives you one of 3 choices to come back. You will lose a little bit of gold and maybe a few items, but it doesn't ever harshly make you lose everything. Although being teleported 3 floors lower, where you can't defeat a single enemy, might be just as bad. Fate and its sequels were developed by a small team, and if you're looking at the gameplay and thinking it looks familiar, you're not wrong. The lead designer, Travis Baldry, also worked on Hellgate London, but he also made Torchlight. The Torchlight games, specifically 1 and 2, are about as close to Diablo as anyone's ever gotten. Torchlight 1 has a lot in common with Fate, which of course also means it's identical to Diablo. You exist in a town, and you go deeper and deeper into a hole with whatever class you pick. Although rather than gothic horror, Torchlight has, especially at the time, a very unique steampunk look. It even has the same pet system of Fate, where your companion can hold stuff, sell stuff, and help you out in combat. You even do the thing where you feed it fish to turn it into a bigger monster. It's pretty crazy how similar these games are. It's the sequel where things get more unhinged. When Diablo 3 came out initially, I wasn't much of a fan. A lot of people were pretty upset, and rightfully so considering the always online requirements and the real money auction house, although I definitely made like 15 bucks on a stupid sword. Considering legendaries had randomly generated stats, maybe Blizzard was the first to put NFTs in their games. Torchlight 2 became Diablo 3 for me and my friends. There wasn't a singular hole, there was a big world to explore, really cool and different classes to play, and it's just a super good time. It's definitely more of a Diablo 2 clone. All the classes are fun and unique, and I'll go engineer any day. As far as clones go though, Torchlight is about as mainstream and normie as it gets, and you've probably already played this if you're watching this video, so we'll keep it light. Just know that Torchlight 3 is a huge disappointment.
PC games are neat and all, but let's talk about consoles. Diablo clones at this point really haven't been on many consoles, but it really is kind of a perfect fit. And to me, that's really where these games started to take off.
Let me know if this sounds familiar. Dr. Pepper, Taco Bell, Megadeth, and Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. You can substitute any metal band. I loved playing action RPGs on my family computer when I was younger, but when I was given the ability to sit in front of the TV in the basement with a GameCube controller in hand, mashing through hundreds of demons, monsters, and rats, that's when it really clicked. The reasoning is simple. Couch co-op. With most of the PC games, you had to connect to some internet service like Battle.net or GameSpy, oftentimes back then taking up the entire phone line and getting yelled at by your family. But with these, you just sat down, passed your friend their crappy Mad Catz controller, and let it rip. Snowblind Studios' Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance was, and still is, one of my favorite one of these types of games. And I'm not just saying that because of the innkeeper, though it certainly didn't hurt.
Beautiful song, isn't it?
Bazonga. It wasn't until my late 20s though that I understood what the Forgotten Realms were. Didn't play D&D till my 30s, no judging. You'd pick one of 3 different race class combos, a human archer, dwarven fighter, or the elven sorceress before getting mugged seconds into the game. Then it's time to hunt rats, bigger rats, and eventually a beholder. There's also a version of this on the Game Boy Advance that I never played, but seems to keep the spirit of Diablo alive. Then we've got Dark Alliance 2, not developed by Snowblind. This wasn't received critically as well, as the game starts to feel a bit archaic in 2004 when it came out, but still loved it, got the t-shirt, played a Drow Monk because I love punching things. Instead, Snowblind Studios would take their talents and massive assets to Sony Online Entertainment for the PS2 exclusive Champions of Norrath and Champions Return to Arms. And in case that wasn't obvious enough, yep, EverQuest. Champions of Norrath is easily one of the best games on the PlayStation 2. Snowblind had their blueprint with Dark Alliance 1 and, in my opinion, perfected it for this game. You pick one of 5 race class combos: Barbarian Warrior, Wood Elf Ranger, High Elf Cleric, Erudite Wizard, and Dark Elf Shadow Knight. Then you start your dungeon crawling, loot dropping journey to save the world of Norrath. I'm not too familiar with EverQuest beyond these games, a 2-week free trial from an AOL demo disc in 2001, and Slash Pizza, but Champions and its sequel were 2 games that I got all my high school friends to play at least once. If I were a bit older, I definitely would have used the online mode for this and Phantasy Star Online, but in 2004, that was a mighty ask of my parents, who vigorously checked the internet history to make sure no one was looking at hentai. Got him. Speaking of that, Dungeons & Dragons Heroes. If you owned an original Xbox back in the day, JRPGs were slim pickings, but Western RPGs were everywhere. This is how I and others played Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, Lord of the Rings, The Third Age, and other games we'll get to, but it was also home to the exclusive Dungeons & Dragons Heroes, and in my opinion, extremely underrated Diablo clone. It just might look a little generic on the outside. Developed by Atari Interactive Hunt Valley, this 4-player co-op Diablo clone dives a bit more into the Gauntlet direction, but of course with plenty of loot and gear to equip. You'll be mashing potions away as you fight tons of dudes, all while your character's screaming out the name of their attacks. Oppa!
Shut up.
God damn it. Guys, stop. I'm trying to record.
This is one of those rare Xbox games that's actually forwards compatible, but only on the original 360. So you can play this in HD, but you'll have to dust off the old red ring machine and pray. Heroes feels really good. It feels even better in a co-op environment, even with a bit of framey issues these days. You could honestly parsec this game over emulation, as it runs decently enough on that if you really want to have a good time, but this seems unfortunately locked away in the vault. Atari's not really doing anything these days. It's technically a licensed game. It's on the original Xbox, and the studio who made it was the original Microprose, who is in Brandon IP ownership city, so yeah. Speaking of licensed games,
Here's where things started to get a little wacky. For some reason, and I don't really know why, Diablo clones really started to gravitate towards licensed games, probably because it was easily done on consoles and the whole concept was just easily reproducible. But they would do this even if it had nothing to do with medieval fantasy or swords and sorcery. You got a kids movie? Make it a Diablo clone. They even did it with religion.
like Holy Spirit, the licensed Diablo clone of the Bible. I tried to play it, but servers are down, so got nothing. But seriously, something like Rise of the Guardians or Shrek 2, they took this format of isometric angle action RPGs and would toss it into anything. This consoleized version of Diablo is still to this day a surefire hit for couch co-op, and I don't blame them for doing this in the slightest. These were definitely less clones and more inspired by or Diablo-like games though. Something a bit straight up more Diablo would be Record of Lotus War for the Dreamcast, a game I covered recently. This came out back in 2000 and really took the concept and ran with it. Just a little less going into hell and more dungeon crawling the entire globe, with some cute anime girls sporting massive shoulder pads. 10 out of 10. Don't forget Digimon World 4. That whole series was different with every game. The first being a monster raising RPG, the second a mystery dungeon, third a standard RPG, and fourth, whatever this was. Never played it myself, but the cover with Agumon and other Digimon holding giant swords has never left my brain. Never forget Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers for the Game Boy Advance. This might look like a simple hack and slash, but no, we got loot, we got Diablo health orbs, and we got the Sauron Spaghetti-O staring down at us from the top right of the screen. Same with its sequel, Return of the King. Obviously, these don't hold a candle to their console counterparts, but not many games do. Even Snowblind Studios would dip their toes into the licensed pool with Justice League Heroes, a game that took the familiar concept and tossed DC superheroes into it. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, that was a response to two of the best licensed Diablo clones out there, X-Men Legends 1 and 2. We don't talk enough about Raven Software, and more people should. These days they're unfortunately in the Activision Call of Duty mines, but they're responsible for some of my favorite licensed games from back in the day. Star Wars Jedi Knight 2, Star Trek Voyager Elite Force, X-Men Origins Wolverine, and that's not even talking about their original stuff like Hexen and Singularity, all solid. Well, the games they made with Marvel are some of the best that Marv's ever had. X-Men Legends 1 and 2 came out around the same time the 2000s Fox movies were getting popular. And they were like, what if Diablo, except you control 4 super mutants at the same time? Thankfully, this doesn't follow the plot of those movies and instead gives us some good old-fashioned comic book stories. With the sequel, X-Men Legends 2, Rise of Apocalypse, diving into one of the most famous stories in the universe, the Age of Apocalypse. I loved and still do love this game. I'd venture to say that nowadays I like Baldur's Gate, but the fluidity of controlling your character in that game doesn't even come close to X-Men Legends. The RPG aspects can be very simplified for people who are newer to this style of game or lazy as well. You still have to manually increase your stat points and spend skill points in order to gain new abilities, each of which can be assigned to a button on the controller, or you can just have the computer do it, which you might as well, considering both of these games have you controlling the whole peanut gallery. Legends 2 has 25 playable characters, so you can imagine those numbers drastic go up.
The numbers don't lie!
Not wanting to stop there, Activision and Raven Software would team up one more time for the game that anyone who got an Xbox 360 around launch probably played, Marvel Ultimate Alliance. Let's increase the number of playable characters to over 30 from all different corners of the Marvel comic universe, toss them into a blender with a fun story and a well-made everything, and you got yourself one of the best reviewed games of 2006. All three of these tread closer into the gamey video game territory where you don't really care too much about the story so much as like being able to control a squad of cool superheroes and punch everything to death. Beautiful. That's what you want. Oh, and it had online and local multiplayer, so what else could you want besides a sequel? Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2. This time diving into the popular Civil War story, Ultimate Alliance 2, developed by Vicarious Visions, was a pretty different game that was a little less Diablo and a little more beat 'em up. All of these console Diablo clones began to get lighter and lighter on the RPG mechanics and aspects and heavier into casual arcade territory. While still decent to great, the divide of this universe gets wider. There is one last game I'd love to cover, and it's the closest thing to a straight up licensed Diablo clone, but it's unfortunately not around anymore. Marvel Heroes, or Marvel Heroes Omega on console, a free-to-play game that has gone way too soon. I played the beta and messed around with Rocket Raccoon years ago and loved it, but it was unfortunately ripped from us suddenly in November 2017 when Disney was like, nah. Disney being crappy, how controversial and unheard of. Omega was actually a fun time, and people who played it a lot seemed to think so as well, but it was marred by constant microtransactions and new hero and skin releases. But unfortunately, no one today will ever be able to try this again. As far as Ultimate Alliance goes, there was a third one that came out in 2019, exclusive to the Switch, but it's so different than its origins now that I can't really classify it in the same category. We do got Warhammer though, lots and lots of Warhammer. I'm sure there's a lot more licensed Diablo clones, but we gotta keep this train rolling. Oh yeah, there's a Silent Hill one, Book of Memories, Vita exclusive, been there, done that. Will I get the Platinum Trophy in it?
No. No way. But I will talk about modern times. One look at any digital sales platform like Steam or PlayStation Network and you'll see quite literally endless Diablo clones. And so I figured, hey, we can't talk about them all, but why not have ourselves a little fancy lightning round? We like those. Let's get started with
Diablo 3. Path of Exile. This is a free-to-play Diablo clone that's existed for nearly 10 years now, but definitely gained popularity in the controversy surrounding Diablo 3's release. The combination of real money auction house and cartoony art style really did a number on it prior to launch, so people wanting that more authentic Diablo experience picked this one up. This is probably the loudest modern clone out there, even though it's nearly a decade old now. And well, it kinda owns. It's got a healthy season system that still pulls in over 100,000 concurrent players monthly, and one of my friends wanted me to talk about it, so here we go. I never got too far into the game personally, mostly because the spare grid leveling system absolutely terrified me. But when you compare Diablo 3 to Exile side by side, only one of them looks like it should have been Diablo. There's a lot of games I didn't really have much time with. Grim Dawn is pretty well regarded. It actually uses the same engine as Titan Quest. That engine's got legs. If you browse the tags for isometric or action RPGs on Steam, there's actually like a countless amount of these to find and play. Some of them free. After all, this whole genre was endlessly popular with free-to-play Korean MMORPGs. You ever played Lineage? If you answered yes, you're probably closer to 40 than 20. This is actually one of the very first Diablo-style clones, more so in appearance than actual gameplay. It shut down in 2011 though, so if you want that modern Diablo Korean MMO fix, you gotta play something like Mu Online, Asura Online, or of course, Lost Ark. I actually played this one for a bit myself. There's no shortage of these, that's for sure. Just be ready for pay-to-win cash shops totally ruining the experience. You gotta be prepared for all of these games to get shut down though. It happens a lot. Speaking of dead games, Darkspore, the Diablo clone that took the monster creation from Spore. This game was weird as heck, but I played it quite a bit when it launched in 2011. I honestly don't remember much about it since it's been shut down since 2016, but there's an appeal in leveling up your terrible, likely phallic creations that not many games offer. These days, you can find a Diablo clone in all kinds of different flavors. There's V Rising, a spin on survival games and action RPGs where you play as a vampire dodging the sun, building up bases and sucking blood to stay alive. This game kinda owns, by the way. Portable consoles have been able to handle these for a while with no problem, so you've got games like Untold Legends or Square Enix's Hero of Ruins. And if we hop over to Japan, you got Nipponichi Software's Witch and the Hundred Knight. This feels like a combination Disgaea and Diablo kind of affair where you play as a small guy doing your best to impress your voluptuous witch creator. This one's even got a sequel. How about a pretty recent modern roguelike? Check out Remy Lore, it's even co-op. But what if we take the hell out of the dungeon crawler and make something for kids? Well, you've got two options. Firstly, Snack World the Dungeon Crawl. Developed by Level 5, Snack World was another attempt to create a multimedia franchise, including anime, toys, and video games. It obviously wasn't very successful. You play as a create-a character who can harness the power of little monsters called snacks who join you in combat. This thing is weirdly convoluted for a supposed kids game, but it's got an extremely memorable soundtrack and art style. Unfortunately, it didn't review well, and I thought it was just okay, but the character customization lets you make some real freaks. That's definitely the highlight. The more popular popular and, well, better kids game is Minecraft Dungeons. If you told me 10 years ago that one day Minecraft would get itself a Diablo clone, I would have laughed myself into an early grave. But hey, it not only makes sense, but it's a pretty decent game. Mojang really nailed the way that this is supposed to feel on a controller, and now that it's been released on pretty much everything, it's one of the most accessible modern action fantasy RPGs out there, which is absurd. It's even got tons of loot. Rather than classes, the game relies on the equipment that you pick up, so you kind of create what you want to be from items. But if you want to look cool, you gotta buy the Minecraft Dungeons Battle Pass. Oh yeah, it's real.
The Diablo clone is like a snow cone truck smorgasbord of flavors, where there's really something for everyone. It's kind of funny and weird to think, considering the original is this very hellish, demonic game, but that's the cool thing about video games. One game becomes such a staple that it becomes a genre that is just a whole thing now. But there's one game I want to mention still today, and it kind of falls directly in the middle of everything we've been talking about. It's weird, it's digital only, it's got famous developers on it, heck, it's even got its own trilogy. I'm not really sure why, but every now and then I start thinking about Deathspank.
I bet like 10 of you popped off there. No more, no less. What happens if you combine The Secret of Monkey Island and Dark Alliance? The answer is the Deathspank trilogy. Originally designed by Ron Gilbert, who worked on all of these, Deathspank is what happens when you take the concept of the action RPG, inject it with a ton of silly humor, and package it into a solid but tight experience. It's one of those games you can beat 100% in 10 hours, but will have you with a little Vegeta smirk the entire time. You play as a guy named, well, Deathspank, who's looking for something called the Artifact. It's generic on purpose. It's more about the journey and the ridiculousness that ensues. It's crazy to think that these were published by EA. It is a rare occurrence to see a big publisher put out smaller games with micro budgets these days, and when it does happen, it's never properly marketed. I mean, did anyone play Lost in Random? I did. I thought it was neat. If you were wondering, this game was originally gonna be called Deathspank Orphans of Justice, so yeah, that probably sets the tone. It's totally goofy, that's probably obvious, but it's also got some challenge to it. You can die real fast, so the gameplay has you utilizing blocking, parrying, and ranged attacks to your advantage. Gear drops pretty frequently, and you use 4 different weapons at the same time. That means you have to combine status effects, types of attacks, and enhanced abilities in order to take down waves of enemies. And they come in big groups. This is called the Justice Meter, and purple epic weapons have additional abilities like a sword spin or a giant AoE stun. It's surprisingly deep for a little digital-only title, especially one that came out in 2010 on the PlayStation 3 and 360, but I think that's a lot of the charm. The side quests, while a little repetitive, usually have funny dialogue and ridiculous characters that'll keep you going until you accidentally finish the entire thing in 1 or 2 sittings. It's more likely than you think. I don't know, I thought it was neat. It may not have the dungeon crawling you'd expect from this genre, but the open world has more than enough enemy slashing and loot dropping to fill up that dopamine sensor. Listen, all I'm saying is that I've never forgotten the cutscene of the Pronginator reveal, the so-called ultimate weapon being this Spaceball style reveal of the longest sword you've ever seen. I loved Deathspank when it came out, love it now, but the second you beat the game, it has a cliffhanger for a sequel where you go from the medieval world immediately into a World War II setting. What? Deathspank Thongs of Virtue. This was originally gonna be a single game, but it got too large for a single downloadable title, and I love it just as much. Coming out a mere 2 months later, this is what Ron Gilbert claimed was acts 2 and 3 of the Spank story, and it's more of the same plus a few more mechanics. The goal of both of these is to give you a pretty fun but smaller scale game with that signature adventure game humor, and I think it succeeds. The sequel's even a little better in some aspects. It might be a totally different setting with like tanks and guns now, but you can still bet on teleporting throughout the world via Outhouse. Instead of looking for the MacGuffin, you're on the quest to find and destroy 6 thongs in order to save the world. Will you? I don't know. This was supposed to be the end, but a year later there'd be another sequel, The Baconing. Same developer, Hothead Games, but missing Ron Gilbert. I guess it was popular and successful enough in order for EA to be like, hey, do it again, but the charm definitely feels a little flat in comparison to the first 2. The jokes are a little more hit and miss, a bit dated in some aspects, but the gameplay is more of the same. It's kind of like the second expansion to a game that you played and loved that came out slightly too late, but you played anyways, cause why not? Deathspank and its trilogy of games may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Diablo clones. It might not even be in the first 10. But when I played these, they stuck in my brain hard enough to be thinking about 12 years later, so I think that counts for something. Just to get used to the voice.
But it still works against cooties, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
And there you have it, the ridiculously deep dungeon crawling, sometimes forgotten, usually always random world of Diablo clones. You know, when I was originally making the concept for this video, I only really wanted to talk about 4 or 5 games, but well, you see what happened there. Remember when in my last video I was like, haha, watch the next one be even longer. Karma. So if there's any cool or notable games you think I should take a look at, you should let me know in the comments, because this is the type of genre that I would definitely check out just for fun. Before you head out, make sure you click the link in the description for today's sponsor, Game Maker. Clicking on the link helps the channel quite a bit, and who knows, maybe you'll make yourself a really cool game one day. But anyways, until then, I've been Austin, and catch me next time when we talk about all of the Sega Marvel MCU games, because we finally played them all. It's clobbering time. Wait, that's wrong.
Thank you all so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Blackfoot Ferret, Chris Shelton, Christopher Oliva, Darren Newton, Doug Prince, DX Buster, David Molnar, Elijah, GM Pinks, Hey Quiggles, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Kevin Zanowski, Kieran Arter, Nick Irving, P-Funk, Ryan Talbert, and Shazan. Thank you all so much for your generous support. As you can tell, I've been putting a lot of work into these videos lately. Me and my editors, both Portly and Joshy, doing a great job. I hope that y'all have been enjoying what we've been putting out, and we have plenty more coming on the way before the end of the year. Also, if you like the music I used for this video, all the Japanese PC 88 and 98 games are really fun. I put the links in the description so you can check them out. Buy the shirts on Pixel Empire, or check out my Patreon, or click the sponsor. Hit subscribe, like, write a comment, and do the YouTube thing. I'm gonna go to bed now.